The terminal buzzed with the usual airport chaos, rolling suitcases, muted overhead announcements, the distant rumble of jets preparing for takeoff. But amid the symphony of motion, a moment of stillness took shape, sharp and unsettling. Camille Rhodes stood at Gate 17, business class boarding pass in hand, a calm presence in the swirling crowd. Dressed in charcoal slacks and a pale blue blouse, her look was simple but elegant. Her afro was neatly picked, her posture upright, and her expression composed. She had the kind of poise that didn't need to shout. Yet to Officer Darren Mays, her presence was somehow suspicious. He didn't know her name, didn't know her title, didn't know her reason for travel. All he saw was a black woman standing alone, confident, unreadable. To him, that was enough to assume something was wrong. He watched her for no more than 20 seconds before striding toward her, one hand on his utility belt, the other already reaching for her boarding pass. "Ma'am," he barked, just loud enough for heads to turn, "I need to verify your ticket and ID again." Camille blinked, slowly, confused. She had already gone through security, already checked in at the gate, already been cleared like every other passenger. "Of course," she said quietly, offering both without protest. The gate agent beside her looked puzzled. She had just scanned Camille's ticket minutes ago without issue, but didn't say a word. Officer Mays squinted at her documents, as if willing them to reveal something incriminating. "What's your business in Los Angeles?" he asked, his voice flat. "I'm attending a leadership roundtable," Camille replied smoothly. She didn't offer more. It wasn't a lie. She was, in fact, scheduled to speak at a high-level summit on transportation equity, a panel that had invited her specifically because of her expertise. But she saw the way he was staring at her, like she was a problem to solve, a box to check, a threat to neutralize. And in that moment, she decided she owed him nothing more than the truth in its smallest, simplest form. "Are you traveling alone?" he continued. "Yes." "Did you pack your own bag?" "I did." "Mind if I have a look?" He motioned to her small carry-on, already tucked neatly under her arm. Around them, other passengers glanced away awkwardly. No one intervened. No one asked why this was happening. Camille gave a measured nod and opened the bag. Inside were a laptop, a leather-bound notebook, 2 books on organizational ethics, and a change of clothes. Nothing out of the ordinary, nothing dangerous. Still, Officer Mays poked around with the tip of his pen as if expecting a hidden compartment to open and unleash something damning. When he found nothing, his lips pursed, frustrated. He handed everything back without apology. "Don't take it personally," he muttered, "just being cautious." Camille gave a quiet, almost imperceptible nod. She zipped her bag and stepped back into the boarding line, heart pounding but face unreadable. She knew what this was. It wasn't about safety. It wasn't about a credible threat. It was about a cop, consumed by his own bias, choosing to flex his authority because her skin, her posture, her calm made him uncomfortable. He couldn't place her, couldn't pin her down, and that was threatening enough. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. But inside, something hardened. Not because she hadn't experienced this before, she had too many times, but because it kept happening. In airports, in conference rooms, in stores, in silence. Every time it happened, it chipped away at something you couldn't always name, but always felt. The erosion of dignity by 1,000 small cuts. A colleague once told Camille she was lucky to have such a composed presence. "You don't let things get to you," they'd said. But that wasn't luck. That was strategy. That was survival. That was the result of years spent navigating spaces where her excellence was doubted and her legitimacy questioned. It was the learned ability to stand still under scrutiny, to never let your voice waver, to keep your face calm even when your blood boiled. As the first-class line moved forward, the gate agent finally raised her voice. "Boarding Group 1, you may proceed." Camille stepped forward once more, her pass now accepted without incident. Officer Mays had retreated to the far side of the terminal, already scanning for his next concern. He didn't even look her way. She walked down the jet bridge, heels clicking steadily, every step a quiet defiance. She found her seat, stowed her bag, and sat down, eyes fixed out the window. She didn't want to make a scene. She didn't want pity. But she wanted the world to know this happened. It happened in 2025. to a black woman with a spotless record, a speaking engagement, and a heart full of purpose. It happened to someone who ran teams, led change, built policies. It happened not because she did something wrong, but because someone with a badge and a bias decided she didn't belong. The plane hadn't even left the ground, and she was already carrying the weight of injustice at 30,000 feet. And still, she straightened her back, reached for her notebook, and began preparing her speech. Because if the world was going to keep challenging her worth, she was going to make sure it remembered her name. She moved like any other traveler, quiet, composed, unassuming. No designer handbag, no entourage, no badge of power. Just a small carry-on, a pressed blouse, and the calm grace of someone who had nothing to prove. Meredith Cole stood at Gate 32 in the heart of Denver International Airport, sipping a cup of tea from a paper cup, her eyes sweeping the boarding area with quiet precision. No one recognized her. No one saw her as anything more than another black woman waiting to board a flight. And that was exactly what she wanted. Because beneath that soft smile and modest outfit stood the CEO of Skyway Connect, one of the fastest growing regional airlines in the country. A woman who had climbed, fought, and soared through every barrier laid before her. But today wasn't about recognition. Today was about truth, about uncovering firsthand how passengers were treated when no one was watching, when the cameras weren't rolling and the name tags didn't say executive. And she'd heard the complaints, not just about delays or seat comfort, but about dismissiveness, cold service, subtle bias. And she knew that if she wanted to lead with integrity, she had to walk through the very same experience her customers did. No shortcuts, no titles, just her. The moment she stepped into line to board, she could already feel it happening. The gate agent barely looked up, her tone clipped and robotic as she scanned the ticket. "Back of the line," she said without even checking the group number. Meredith blinked, confused, glancing at her pass. "Group 1, first class." She hesitated. "I believe I'm Group 1, she said gently. The agent sighed and looked again, then muttered something under her breath, stepping aside. No apology, no acknowledgement, just silent permission to pass. Meredith exhaled, keeping her posture tall, her heart slightly heavier. This was why she was here. She found her seat 2A by the window and settled in. A businessman in a tailored suit took the seat beside her and gave a polite nod. Across the aisle, a flight attendant helped a white couple stow their luggage, chatting warmly, offering drinks even before takeoff. When the attendant reached Meredith's row, her tone shifted. "Keep your bag under the seat," she said sharply, barely meeting her eyes. Meredith nodded. "Could I get a water, please?" she asked quietly. The attendant sighed. After takeoff. No warmth, no eye contact. And just like that, Meredith Cole, the CEO, was invisible. Not because she lacked authority, but because authority didn't look like her to them. It didn't come wrapped in brown skin and quiet confidence. Not in their eyes. She sat still, the plane lifting into the sky, but her heart sinking. It wasn't just the service, it was the assumption. The way she had been dismissed, overlooked, spoken down to. And the more she thought about it, the more determined she became. Because this wasn't just a flight, it was a mirror, and what she saw in it broke her heart. Not for herself, but for the thousands of people who flew every day and were made to feel small. People who didn't have the title of CEO to shield them. People whose dignity was too often the first casualty in the name of efficiency. She jotted notes in a small, leather-bound journal. Tiny observations, things no report could ever fully capture. The uneven tone of welcome, the lack of eye contact, the warmth that was rationed like privilege. And as she wrote, her seatmate leaned over. "Traveling for business?" he asked politely. Meredith smiled. "Something like that," she replied. He nodded and turned back to his tablet, never guessing that the woman beside him had the power to rewrite the policies that governed every employee on the plane. When the flight landed and passengers began to disembark, Meredith lingered. She let the crowd pass, observing how the attendants interacted with each group. She watched as they gave extra smiles to some and hurried others along without a glance. When she finally stood, one of the crew barely looked up. "Thanks for flying," the attendant mumbled. Meredith gave a quiet nod and stepped into the jet bridge. No one knew what was coming next. The following morning, Meredith walked into the corporate headquarters, not in disguise, not as Miss Cole the traveler, but as Meredith Cole, the CEO. She called an emergency meeting with senior leadership and read aloud, line by line, from the notes she had taken. Every microaggression, every moment of bias, every failure in service. Her voice didn't waver. Her hands didn't shake. And when she finished, she looked each executive in the eye and said, "If I'm being treated this way, imagine what our customers go through." There was silence, then murmurs, then change. Within weeks, Meredith launched the Compassion in Flight Initiative, a sweeping reform program focused on equity, empathy, and accountability. Bias training was overhauled. Customer feedback processes were redesigned. Every flight attendant, gate agent, and support staff member would now be evaluated not just on efficiency, but on how they made people feel. And Meredith didn't stop there. She began speaking publicly, sharing her undercover experiences, challenging the entire industry to do better. So if you're still listening, I want you to remember this. Leadership doesn't always wear a name tag. Power doesn't always walk loud. Sometimes it boards quietly, observes silently, and works in the shadows until it's time to rise and speak. Meredith Cole didn't have to make a scene to make change. She carried her truth with calm strength and used it not to punish, but to transform. If this story moved you, drop a comment below to encourage every woman who leads with quiet power. Like this video to show your support for real change. And subscribe to our channel for more stories like this, because truth deserves a voice and justice deserves wings. It should have been routine, boarding a flight, taking a seat, and disappearing into the clouds like every other traveler that morning. But for Meredith Cole, nothing about this journey was going to be routine. She arrived at Gate 17 at Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson Airport with 20 minutes to spare before boarding. Calm, composed, and dressed in a simple gray sweater and black slacks, Meredith moved with quiet confidence, clutching her boarding pass and a sleek carry-on. No one gave her a second glance, at least not at first. To the crowd, she was just another black woman traveling alone. But beneath that modest exterior was someone no one could have guessed. The CEO of Skyway Connect Airlines, traveling undercover to assess firsthand how customers were treated. A string of complaints had reached her desk, some whispered, some loud. Reports of dismissive tone, excessive scrutiny, and disproportionately poor treatment toward passengers of color. Meredith needed to see it for herself. What she didn't expect was to become the next case study. She stood patiently in line, scrolling through emails and smiling at a toddler tugging at her mother's coat in front of her. When her group was called, Meredith stepped forward, offered a polite nod to the gate agent, and handed over her ID and boarding pass. The agent, a young woman named Tasha, gave a clipped one moment and turned toward the security officer patrolling nearby. That's when Officer Donovan Myers appeared, tall, broad-shouldered, and already scowling as if the mere act of existing near his gate was a threat. He approached quickly, his gaze fixed on Meredith. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said sharply. "Step aside." Meredith blinked, confused but calm. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice measured. "Your documents need to be verified again," he barked, not answering the question. Tasha hesitated, clearly uneasy. "Her ID scanned fine," she mumbled, but Donovan ignored her, motioning again for Meredith to step away from the line. Heads turned. Conversations fell quiet. The whisper of discomfort spread through the gate like fog. Meredith complied, stepping to the side, gripping her carry-on just a little tighter. "What exactly are you verifying?" she asked. "Standard procedure," Donovan muttered, already rifling through her ID, his eyes narrowing at every detail. "What's your business on this flight?" "I'm a paying customer with a valid ticket," she replied, not flinching. "That's my business." Donovan didn't like the answer. "Who packed your bag? Where are you headed? Are you traveling alone?" The interrogation intensified. Meredith answered every question calmly. She refused to escalate. But then he asked the one thing that cut deeper than any of the others. "Why are you flying first class?" A hush fell over the space. It wasn't just what he asked. It was how he asked it. The implication was clear. Someone like her didn't belong there. "Because I paid for it," she replied, steel slipping into her voice. She could feel the heat rising in her chest. She'd faced barriers before. Closed doors, whispered doubts, but rarely so blatant. She could have ended it right there. Could have pulled rank, shown her badge, revealed that the very airline they were about to board was hers. But she didn't. Because this wasn't just about her. It was about how people without her power were treated every single day. Just as the tension seemed to peak, a young man in the crowd stepped forward, a college student who had been quietly observing from the corner. "Excuse me," he said, voice shaking. "I saw her check in. She didn't do anything wrong." Donovan turned, annoyed. "This doesn't concern you." But it did. "It does," the young man replied, heart pounding. "Because if this can happen to her, it can happen to my mom, my sister, my professor." For a moment, time stood still. The crowd grew restless. A few people murmured agreement. One woman pulled out her phone and began recording. Donovan faltered. His authority now being questioned, he realized he had nothing concrete, no suspicion he could justify, no evidence of wrongdoing, just his own discomfort with her presence. Finally, he shoved her ID and boarding pass back into her hand and stepped back. "You're free to board," he said gruffly. Meredith took a deep breath, nodded, and turned back to the gate. As she walked down the jet bridge, her heart raced. Not out of fear, but from the overwhelming weight of injustice. She thought of the young man who had spoken up. She thought of every person who never got that chance. Those pulled aside, doubted, detained, and disrespected simply because they didn't fit someone else's idea of who belongs. She found her seat, 2D, settled in, and finally let her breath fall. The flight took off, but her mind didn't quiet. She replayed the entire scene in her head. Each word, each sideways glance, each accusation veiled as protocol. She thought of her employees, her passengers, her responsibility. And she knew what she had to do. By the time the flight landed, Meredith was no longer undercover. She made a call to her executive team and requested a full internal review of airport interactions, beginning with gate training and law enforcement partnerships. She also arranged a meeting with the Atlanta Airport Board. She wouldn't name the officer, not yet, but she would make sure every traveler walking through her airline's gates would be treated with dignity, from the coach seat to the cockpit. If this story stirred something in you, speak it, share it, because silence protects the problem. And if you believe every person, regardless of race or role, deserves dignity, drop a comment below to encourage Meredith's mission. Like this story. Subscribe to hear more voices that rise with grace, even when they're wronged. Because it's not just about this one woman. It's about every traveler whose strength is their quiet resistance. As the plane's cabin door sealed shut with a soft hiss and the crew began their final preparations, Meredith Cole sat still in her seat, 3A, business class window, as if trying to absorb the silence after the storm. Only minutes earlier, she had been pulled aside by Officer Donovan Myers under false suspicion, questioned with a chilling intensity that cut deeper than his words. The humiliation of being treated as a threat for doing nothing more than boarding a plane still clung to her skin like cold air. But now, high above the clouds, her breath began to settle. She took a long, quiet inhale and reminded herself why she was here. Not just as a traveler, not even just as a CEO, but as a witness. A mirror to reflect the truth of how people like her were too often treated. A flight attendant passed by with practiced ease, offering a warm but hurried smile. "Can I get you anything to drink before takeoff?" Meredith glanced up and nodded. "Just water, thank you." Her voice was soft, its steadiness a triumph in itself. The attendant disappeared and Meredith shifted her gaze to the window. Outside, the tarmac blurred past in streaks of concrete and sunlight. She watched the flurry of airport motion, fuel trucks, baggage carts, workers with fluorescent vests, all of it a dance she knew intimately. She had once walked those service roads herself in her early days, learning every cog in the machine before she ever dared to lead it. But no one on this plane knew who she was. No one recognized that the woman in seat 3A owned the airline, that she had crafted the very flight route they were taking. She was deliberately dressed plainly, slacks, flats, a tan trench coat folded over her lap, to blend in, to observe without the distortions that came with power. The incident at the gate had proved, once again, that titles and roles couldn't shield her from bias when those judging her had already made up their minds. She retrieved a small leather notebook from her bag and opened it discreetly. Inside were handwritten notes from other flights she had taken undercover. Praises for polite flight crews, concerns about rushed service, inconsistent tone and gate agents, in the occasional warm encounter that restored a bit of faith. She began a new entry. Gate experience, unacceptable, she wrote. Pulled aside without cause. Officer's demeanor aggressive, no apology or rationale. Gate agent uneasy but complicit, notified corporate security for record. Action item. Revisit law enforcement partnerships and define training expectations for working with vulnerable travelers. She paused, her pen hovered midair. The memory of Donovan's stare, the way it held more judgment than suspicion, unspooled in her mind. How many others had felt this same heat beneath someone's gaze? How many had shrunk, apologized, internalized the weight of being told, without words, you do not belong here? The flight attendant returned with her water and set it gently on the tray. We'll be up in the air soon, she said kindly. Let me know if there's anything else you need. Meredith nodded, appreciating the effort in the woman's voice. It wasn't extraordinary, but it was respectful. Still, she couldn't help but notice how the crew greeted the man in 3B, white, middle-aged, in a tailored blazer, with more familiarity, more deference. Small differences. Easy to miss. But they mattered. As the plane taxied toward the runway, Meredith watched the passengers around her. Some scrolled through emails. One napped already, chin slumped forward. A young woman behind her excitedly whispered to her travel companion about a job interview in Chicago. Meredith closed her eyes briefly. These were her people, her customers, and she had a duty to protect them not just from delays or discomfort, but from indignity. The engines roared as the plane lifted, the city of Atlanta shrinking beneath them. Meredith kept her eyes on the horizon until the clouds swallowed the skyline. She turned her attention back to her notebook. Mid-flight service had begun. The attendant returned with meal options. Meredith chose the vegetable ravioli, watching how long it took for other passengers to be served, noting how attentively refills were offered, or not. When her coffee came lukewarm, she didn't complain. Instead, she added it to her notes, not to scold, but to improve. Later, she initiated a quiet conversation with the elderly couple seated across the aisle. They were heading to Chicago to visit their granddaughter, they said. They praised the crew, friendly as always, but mentioned that their wheelchair request was ignored at the gate. It's not a big deal, the woman said with a dismissive chuckle. But Meredith knew it was. She jotted it down. Another ripple in the system. As the flight wore on, Meredith found herself wrestling with more than just logistics. She felt a growing pressure, not from the altitude, but from the weight of responsibility. Being CEO was never about corner offices or profit margins. It was about stewardship. And that meant asking the hardest questions, especially when the answers pointed back to the organization she had built. Have we truly done enough, she wondered? Are we protecting every passenger, or only the ones who look the part? She looked around the cabin again. No one knew what she carried, not just the title, the pain, the vision, the memory of her grandmother being told to leave a whites-only waiting room decades ago. The memory of her first solo flight as a young girl, where a stranger asked if she was in the wrong seat. The memory of being asked, even as a VP, to show ID when others in suits were waved through without question. As the flight began its descent, Meredith placed her pen down and looked once more out the window. The city lights of Chicago twinkled like stars scattered across the earth. She felt tired but not defeated. Because this quiet note-taking, this listening, this living proof was power. And she would wield it with purpose. Tomorrow she would walk into a boardroom and tell the truth. Not just about flight schedules and coffee temperatures, but about dignity and how fragile it becomes when left unguarded. She would speak, not just as a CEO, but as a witness, because change doesn't start in headlines or policy binders. It starts here, in seat 3A, high above the world, with a woman quietly watching, hurting, and promising herself she would not let this story be wasted. Not again, not ever. What happens when someone in uniform refuses to let go of their own prejudice, even after being proven wrong? When an officer, instead of reflecting on his mistake, lets his bruised ego fester into something darker, more dangerous. Meredith Cole, CEO of Skyway Connect, never imagined that a routine undercover flight would ignite an obsession in Officer Donovan Myers, an obsession that would follow her across state lines, turning into a chilling post-flight retaliation that tested not only her safety, but the very ideals she stood for. And today I ask you to listen closely, not just to what happened, but to how one woman's unwavering strength turned fear into fire and power into purpose. After the confrontation at the gate where Myers had unjustly detained and interrogated her, only to discover later that she was the CEO of the very airline he tried to humiliate, Meredith thought the ordeal was behind her. She had boarded that flight with grace, documented the experience like she always did, and flown quietly to Chicago, where she continued her unannounced evaluation of her company's services. She had spoken to passengers, taken detailed notes, and kept her true identity discreet, as she always did during these anonymous journeys. But what Meredith didn't know was that Officer Myers couldn't let it go. Humiliated after being subtly dismissed at the gate, Myers began digging. He accessed passenger lists through a friend in airport IT, violating protocol. He ran Meredith's travel name through unofficial channels, slowly piecing together her real identity, and when he realized who she was, not just a corporate figure, but a black woman wielding authority, his bruised ego twisted into resentment. It started with calls to Skyway Connect's offices. Posing as a federal investigator, Myers claimed he was looking into anomalies in travel documentation. Meredith's assistant, Kimberly, flagged the calls immediately, sensing something was off. But Myers wasn't deterred. He cross-referenced flight schedules, noted her return itinerary, and made a quiet promise to himself. He'd confront her again. This time, he'd be prepared. This time, she wouldn't be so smug. This time, he'd regain control. When Meredith landed back at Atlanta's airport 3 days later, the terminal was quiet, humming with the subdued energy of late-night arrivals. She walked through the baggage claim, her coat draped over one arm, suitcase rolling behind her. That's when she saw him, Officer Myers, leaning against the column, arms folded, watching. Her stomach tightened. She paused mid-step. He stepped forward, slow and deliberate. "Miss Cole," he said, "we need to talk." "No, we don't," she replied calmly, though her pulse spiked. "You already violated my rights once. I suggest you don't repeat that mistake." Myers' jaw clenched. "I have reason to believe there's been a misrepresentation of credentials. We may be dealing with identity fraud." "You're lying," Meredith cut in, voice sharp. "You know exactly who I am. You're not here because of protocol. You're here because I embarrassed you." Passengers around them began to take notice. Some paused, staring. Others moved on quickly, unwilling to get involved. Meredith stood her ground. "You're abusing your badge," she continued, her voice low but clear. "And if you don't walk away now, I will make sure your department sees this for what it is, targeted harassment." But Myers didn't back down. He motioned toward a private security corridor. "Let's step inside," he said, "just to clear things up." Meredith refused to move. "If you attempt to detain me without legal cause, you'll be hearing from my lawyers. And I promise you, this time, it won't be quiet." A nearby airport supervisor, alerted by the commotion, stepped in. "Is there a problem here?" "There is," Meredith said, not breaking eye contact with Myers. "This officer has been stalking me across state lines. He accessed my records illegally, and now he's attempting to detain me without cause." Myers' confidence cracked. "That's not what this is." "Then what is it?" the supervisor asked, arms crossed. Myers hesitated. "Just checking something, no need to escalate." But it was already too late. Kimberly, Meredith's assistant, had informed legal counsel earlier that day that Myers had been calling. The company had quietly prepared statements, and Meredith had instructed her team to document everything. Now, the supervisor was watching, several employees nearby were listening, and airport security had been alerted. Meredith turned, not waiting for Myers to respond. "I'm done here," and she walked away. But the emotional toll of that encounter lingered. That night in her apartment, Meredith sat alone in the dark with her phone in her hands. She stared at a message from Kimberly. "We've started internal escalation. Legal is drafting a formal complaint to the department. We're with you." She wanted to cry, but didn't. She was angry, yes. Tired, definitely. But more than that, she was determined. Because what had happened to her had happened to too many people for far too long. People who didn't have the title or the power to fight back. The next morning, Meredith released a statement to her employees, not detailing the entire incident, but reaffirming the company's commitment to dignity, justice, and accountability. "What we allow," she wrote, "is what we encourage. I want every team member to know. Your humanity matters more than a title, a badge, or a seat on a plane. Over the next few weeks, the story slowly leaked. An anonymous source from the airport confirmed the incident. Activist groups picked it up. And eventually, Myers was placed on suspension pending investigation. But Meredith didn't stop there. She used the ordeal to launch a new initiative at Skyway Connect, a passenger protection task force. Its goal, to partner with legal advisors, community leaders, and law enforcement reform advocates to train officers in implicit bias and ensure travelers are treated equally, regardless of background. Because Meredith knew power without empathy is just control, and silence in the face of injustice is complicity. So if this story stirred something in you, if you've ever watched someone be targeted, dismissed, or humiliated simply because they didn't look like they belonged, then let this be your reminder that one voice, calm and unwavering, can shift the ground beneath injustice. Comment below to support Meredith's strength. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe to this channel for more stories of resilience, truth, and the people who are brave enough to say, this ends here. It's one thing to quietly bear the weight of prejudice. It's another to be forced to confront it head-on in front of an entire airport terminal. Meredith Cole knew that discrimination was a constant shadow in her life, a shadow that sometimes crept into the most unexpected corners, but she'd learned to carry it with grace. She had worked hard for everything she had, her career, her success, her position as the CEO of Skyway Connect. But when Officer Donovan Myers decided that the unassuming woman standing before him couldn't possibly belong in the first-class cabin of the very airline she ran, Meredith knew that this moment would not be like the others. It would not be one of quiet resignation. This time, it would be a moment of power, a moment where she would stand her ground, refusing to shrink, refusing to allow her dignity to be ripped away because of her skin. She had tried to keep it low-key, traveling incognito under an alias to assess the true service quality of her airline. She had witnessed the staff treating passengers with indifference, making assumptions, and even showing open hostility. All of this had pushed her to start these undercover inspections, an effort to observe her airline's customer service firsthand, without the gloss of corporate influence or the polished facade most executives received. She had done it for months without issue. But something about Officer Myers, a figure of authority standing at the security line, silently assessing and judging everyone around him, rubbed her the wrong way. She knew this type all too well, someone whose idea of order and control was rooted in a deep, insidious prejudice. When he had first approached her, asking for her ID with an air of distrust, she had been taken aback. She had tried to remain composed, as she always did. She knew that some people, often without realizing it, would question her presence in spaces meant for the elite because she was a black woman. But she also knew she didn't owe anyone an explanation, let alone a man whose gaze was filled with suspicion. Still, Meredith had allowed the process to unfold, trusting that she could resolve it without raising a scene. She handed over her boarding pass and ID without a second thought, only to have Officer Myers escalate things, insisting she step aside. His questions grew more pointed, more personal. He asked her if her carry-on was the only bag, why she wasn't traveling with any luxury items. And in that moment, the underlying assumption behind each of those questions became painfully clear. He thought she didn't belong. In that moment, something inside Meredith shifted. She could feel the eyes of everyone around her, the passengers who were trying to pretend they weren't noticing, the gate agent who had begun to squirm in her shoes, the others who whispered and pointed as if she were somehow the one causing a disturbance. But the truth was that Meredith wasn't the problem. She wasn't the one creating chaos. It was Officer Myers, with his assumptions, his bias, and his disregard for basic decency. Her patience had worn thin, but she didn't lose her cool. Instead, she did what she always did. She took control. She dialed her assistant, Kimberly, without a second thought. Her voice was steady but firm as she said, "I need you to meet me at the gate and be prepared to verify my identity as soon as possible." Myers, not one to let go of a situation that had already spiraled out of his control, smirked. "Go ahead and make your call," he said dismissively, "but it won't change anything." His words dripped with the condescension of someone convinced that his authority was unquestionable. But Meredith's silence spoke volumes. She didn't even acknowledge his jab. She simply stepped aside, her shoulders squared, her head held high as she waited. She knew exactly what was coming. She knew that this moment wasn't about justifying herself to anyone. It was about revealing with unflinching confidence the truth of who she was. Minutes passed. The crowd shifted uneasily. They murmured, wondering why this seemingly ordinary woman was being held up. Some of them had heard Myers' accusations, while others had simply sensed the tension between the two. But they didn't know what Meredith knew. They didn't know that she wasn't just any regular traveler. She wasn't the woman they assumed her to be. She was, in fact, the CEO of the airline that employed Officer Myers and everyone else working at that gate. When David Robinson, her husband, and Skyway Connect's co-owner arrived at the gate, the air in the terminal seemed to shift. There was no grand entrance, no booming declaration. His presence, however, was undeniable. He cut through the murmurs and uncertain glances with a calm power that immediately commanded the room's attention. His tall frame, his tailored suit, his demeanor, all of it spoke volumes even before he spoke a word. "Is there a problem here?" David's voice was steady, but there was a hard edge to it that left no room for ambiguity. Officer Myers was caught off guard. He had been so wrapped up in his suspicion and assumptions that he hadn't even realized who had been standing in front of him all along. "Yes, there is," Meredith said, her voice no longer as soft, no longer as controlled. There was a sharpness now, a firmness. "This man detained me without cause and questioned my identity, despite having no evidence that anything was wrong." David turned his gaze to Myers, his eyes narrowing. "I want to know why. I'd like an explanation for why you thought it was acceptable to harass my wife in front of everyone here." Myers faltered, his earlier bravado evaporating under David's gaze. "She was acting suspicious," he muttered, but there was no conviction in his words. Meredith stepped forward, her voice steady but cutting through the tension in the room. "You didn't treat me like a regular passenger, Officer Myers. You treated me like I didn't belong. Because of my skin, because of the way I looked. You assumed I was an outsider in a space that I own and operate. And that was the mistake you made." The room grew quiet, save for the sound of whispers now swelling around them. The passengers began to shift, moving closer to hear the exchange, some nodding in agreement, others shifting awkwardly, unsure of how to react. David didn't wait for Myers to speak again. He turned to the gate agent, who had been silent throughout the ordeal, her eyes wide with nervousness. "We're boarding now," David said. "My wife will board first, and this will be addressed properly." The gate agent nodded quickly, her hands shaking as she scanned Meredith's boarding pass and allowed her through without hesitation. But as Meredith stepped onto the jet bridge, she glanced back. She caught Officer Myers standing in the background, his expression one of defeat. His head was hanging low, his arrogance deflated. Meredith knew the situation was far from over. But in that moment, something had shifted. She had stood her ground, not just for herself, but for every passenger who had ever been mistreated or wrongly judged because of the color of their skin. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but she had taken the first step toward exposing a truth that couldn't be ignored. And that truth was this: standing up in the face of prejudice, regardless of the consequences, is the first step in creating real change. The power to expose injustice lies in the quiet strength of those who choose to speak up. News of Meredith Cole's unjust detention at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport spread like wildfire, igniting a national conversation that would forever change the way air travel and the world at large viewed racial bias in everyday encounters. It was not just a random incident of mistreatment. It was the kind of deeply ingrained prejudice that had for too long festered behind closed doors. This time, it wasn't being swept under the rug. This time, the story would be heard by millions. Meredith had never imagined that the simple act of trying to board a flight would result in a viral outpouring of anger and support. Yet, as soon as her confrontation with Officer Donovan Myers was over, the whispers in the terminal turned into something much bigger. Cell phone cameras had captured the scene, and within hours, social media was alive with posts, tweets, and hashtags calling for justice. Justice for Meredith and #end racial profiling spread across platforms, drawing the attention of both civil rights advocates and those who had personally suffered similar treatment. The photos of Meredith standing stoically while a police officer interrogated her had become symbols of defiance, strength, and the fight for dignity. Meredith, ever the composed professional, had hoped to handle the situation quietly within the confines of the law. She never intended to become a public figure, but that hope was dashed when the media outlets, or local and national, began picking up the story. Within hours, news anchors were reporting the incident, their tones varying from righteous outrage to sorrowful empathy, but each one echoing the same sentiment. This was not just an isolated incident. It was a reflection of something much deeper that needed to be addressed. As the story spread, so did the pressure on the authorities, who couldn't ignore the mounting calls for accountability. From the safety of her office, Meredith had initially kept a low profile, allowing her PR team to handle the situation. But it quickly became clear that this was not just a matter of corporate crisis management. The voices demanding change weren't just from journalists. They were from people who had lived through similar discrimination, people whose stories had been buried in the quiet shame of their own experiences. They were angry, and they wanted answers. Meredith's phone didn't stop buzzing, with text messages and emails flooding her inbox from colleagues, journalists, and, strangely enough, from people she didn't even know. The messages ranged from congratulations to expressions of empathy and, most often, solidarity. One message stood out, a direct tweet from a well-known civil rights leader addressing Meredith by name. "Your courage to stand up has opened the door for so many who have felt silenced. Thank you for showing us the power of standing firm." Had end racial profiling in Meredith Cole. The tweet was shared by thousands. It was no longer just about one person's story. It was about a collective experience. It was about people coming together to demand that their dignity be acknowledged, that their rights be respected. They weren't just rallying for Meredith. They were rallying for themselves. For all the Black and brown travelers who had endured microaggressions, harsh judgments, and dismissals at every airport checkpoint. Meredith's heart swelled with a mix of pride and sadness. Pride that her voice, quiet but powerful, was contributing to this necessary national dialogue. But sadness, too, because she realized that for all the strides society had made, these kinds of moments were still happening far too frequently. She realized that even with her position of influence, she could never have known how many people had experienced the same kind of bias she had faced in varying degrees. It wasn't just about one officer's behavior anymore. It was about the system, the attitudes, and the policies that allowed such behavior to thrive. By the time the story hit the front page of major news outlets, including national outlets like the New York Times and the Washington Post, Meredith became a household name. The media began reaching out for interviews, asking her to share her story, her thoughts on racial profiling, and what she intended to do about it. Meredith, in her usual fashion, agreed to a press conference, but this time the atmosphere was different. She wasn't just answering questions. She was becoming the face of an uprising, the voice that millions of people had longed for but never had. She didn't realize at the time how much this moment would demand from her, not just emotionally but as a public figure. But there was no turning back. Meredith would be a leader in this fight, whether she had planned to be one or not. As the press conference approached, Meredith spent hours preparing, her thoughts swirling as she reviewed every bit of information she had gathered. But as the cameras rolled, she stood tall, her calm voice cutting through the charged atmosphere. Her message was simple but forceful. What happened to me was not just an isolated event. It's a reflection of the systemic bias that exists in the air travel industry, in law enforcement, and beyond. The fact that my treatment was influenced by my race, despite my clear credentials, should be a wake-up call to us all. Meredith's words were met with applause, not just from those present in the room, but from the millions watching online. It wasn't a victory, not yet, but it was the start of something bigger. The following weeks saw a steady stream of supportive voices flooding social media. High-profile figures from all walks of life, from athletes to entertainers to politicians, stood in solidarity with Meredith, using their platforms to amplify her message. The hashtag #JusticeForMeredith became a global rallying cry, representing the fight for fairness and the end of racial profiling. The conversation shifted, the focus now firmly on the need for reforms in airport security and law enforcement procedures. And then came the turning point. A few weeks after the incident, an internal investigation uncovered evidence that Officer Donovan Myers had a history of similar behavior, harassing and detaining people of color under dubious pretenses. The public outrage grew as more stories emerged of passengers who had faced similar treatment. One woman even came forward, sharing her experience of being detained for hours over a minor issue, only to be released with no apology or explanation. The spotlight now shifted to a national conversation about the entrenched racism that still permeated many institutions. But it wasn't just about the individual officers. It was about the system that allowed these practices to persist. And Meredith wasn't letting it stop at her story. She spoke with lawmakers, traveled to various airports to speak with staff, and pushed for stricter regulations to prevent future incidents. Her work even led to her being invited to sit on a federal advisory board for airport safety and anti-discrimination policies. Her life, her career, and her legacy had been irreversibly changed, but for the better. She knew the fight wasn't over, but she also knew that with every passing day, the world was becoming a little bit better, a little bit fairer. Through it all, Meredith's resolve remained unshaken. She had become the face of a movement, but the fight, she knew, was not hers alone. She had seen the power of solidarity, the power of voices rising together. And with each story, each post, each call for change, she knew that her mission, her real mission, was just beginning. In the end, it was clear. Meredith Cole had not just overcome an unjust encounter. She had ignited a movement, a national uprising that would forever change the face of air travel, law enforcement, and the fight for racial equality in America. Meredith Cole's experience at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport became a defining moment not just for her, but for countless individuals who had experienced similar acts of discrimination in silence. What should have been a simple flight turned into an encounter with injustice that would ripple across the nation. Officer Donovan Myers, the officer who had harassed her based purely on the color of her skin, couldn't have known the far-reaching consequences of his actions when he decided to challenge her. But the moment he targeted her, everything changed. Not just for him, but for the broader culture that had allowed such systemic discrimination to thrive for so long. Meredith had always prided herself on her ability to stay composed in difficult situations. As the CEO of Skyway Connect, she had encountered challenges far more significant than this before, but nothing had prepared her for the cold, dismissive manner in which Officer Myers treated her that day at the gate. What had started as a subtle suspicion, a glance here, a raised eyebrow there, quickly escalated into full-blown profiling. As a Black woman traveling alone, Meredith was no stranger to the quiet biases that seeped into daily interactions. Still, being questioned by an officer, having her belongings searched, and being detained in front of a crowd of passengers felt like a slap in the face. She had done nothing wrong, yet her appearance seemed to have been enough to make her a target. When Meredith stood her ground, calmly insisting on her right to board the flight, she could feel the heat of the eyes around her, the curious onlookers, the uneasy staff members, the uncomfortable passengers. She knew deep down that this moment wasn't just about her. It was about every single person who had been made to feel less than simply because of their race. The situation, as unfair and intrusive as it was, reminded her of the countless others who didn't have the means, the position, or the power to challenge such blatant prejudice. For those people, Meredith's quiet strength would become a symbol of what it meant to stand up against systemic bias. But the story didn't end when Meredith finally boarded the plane. What followed was a firestorm of reactions. News outlets ran with the story, picking apart the details of the encounter, and social media erupted with an outpouring of both outrage and support. People began sharing their own experiences with racial profiling, many revealing how they, too, had been targeted because of their skin color. The story wasn't just about Meredith anymore. It became a collective cry for justice. The faces of all the Black and brown passengers who had suffered in silence now appeared on the screens, demanding to be heard. As the days passed, Meredith, who had always been a reserved, private person, found herself thrust into the spotlight. The attention, while overwhelming, did not shake her resolve. She spoke openly about the incident, not for personal gain, but because she realized that what happened to her could not continue unchecked. The media followed her every move, asking questions, seeking answers, and putting pressure on the authorities to take action against Officer Myers. And slowly but surely, the truth started to come out. Meredith's case was only one in a long line of similar incidents that had been buried by a system unwilling to confront its own biases. But with her testimony, the cracks in the system began to widen. Despite the media frenzy, Meredith knew that the real challenge lay ahead. The officer who had detained her, Officer Donovan Myers, wasn't just any law enforcement agent. He was a symbol of the biases embedded within the institution, and if left unchecked, his actions would continue to harm others. It wasn't enough for Meredith to stand up for herself. She knew she had to take this further. This wasn't just about a personal victory. This was about ensuring that no one else ever felt the sting of discrimination as she had. And so, she worked tirelessly, speaking with civil rights organizations, urging them to rally behind her, and advocating for changes that would ensure greater accountability for those in power. She met with lawmakers, shared her story, and pushed for legislative reforms that would hold both law enforcement and corporations accountable for their actions. Meanwhile, Officer Myers was far from oblivious to the storm he had caused. The weight of the public outcry quickly became too much to bear. At first, he tried to justify his actions, telling himself that his suspicions were valid, that he had done his job. But as more stories of racial profiling surfaced, stories that mirrored Meredith's own experience, Donovan couldn't help but feel the quiet weight of his guilt creeping in. For years, he had walked through life with an unwavering belief in his own righteousness, convinced that his bias was simply a form of vigilance. But as the media spotlight intensified, he realized the truth. His behavior had been rooted in prejudice, not protection. He had failed to do his job in the way it was meant to be done. As the investigation into Donovan's actions gained momentum, more passengers came forward with their own stories. It was discovered that Meredith wasn't the only one he had targeted based on nothing more than their race. A series of complaints surfaced, each one recounting similar treatment. People detained for no reason, their personal belongings searched without cause, their dignity stripped away. Officer Myers' record was now under scrutiny, and it wasn't pretty. The case against him was stacking up, one witness at a time. The disciplinary hearing that followed was a turning point. Donovan, who had once walked with confidence in his uniform, was now facing the consequences of his actions. He sat at the table, his shoulders slumped in defeat, as the internal affairs officers presented the evidence. The complaints, the testimonies, the countless instances where his behavior had crossed the line. The room was heavy with the sound of silence, as Donovan's defenses fell apart under the weight of the facts. There was no justification for what he had done. There was no excuse for the racial profiling that had become his second nature. When it came a time for him to speak, he struggled to find words. He tried to explain his actions, to present himself as a man simply doing his job, but the room saw through him. His colleagues, the very people who had once supported him, now looked at him with disdain. And when the final decision was announced, Donovan Myers was to be terminated from his position. It wasn't just a verdict on one man's actions. It was a victory for all those who had suffered in silence. Donovan's life, as he knew it, began to unravel in the wake of his firing. The department's investigation revealed not just one instance of racial profiling, but a pattern of abuse that had been allowed to persist for far too long. The ramifications of his actions spread across the department, leading to broader reforms and a reevaluation of training protocols. For Meredith, the sense of justice was bittersweet. She had no personal satisfaction in seeing Donovan's downfall, but she knew it was necessary. He had allowed his biases to dictate his actions, and in the end, it was his own prejudice that had destroyed his career. In the weeks that followed, Meredith worked to channel the attention surrounding her case into positive change. She pushed for new policies at Skyway Connect, including mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all staff, and implemented an anonymous reporting system for employees to report discriminatory actions without fear of retaliation. It wasn't just about changing policies. It was about changing hearts and minds. And as for Officer Myers, his career had ended, but his story served as a reminder of the power of accountability. The final twist in this story came when a group of travelers, who had once been victims of similar profiling by Donovan, reached out to Meredith. They thanked her for giving them the courage to speak up. And in that moment, Meredith realized that her fight for justice was not just about her own experience. It was about the thousands of people who had faced the same challenges, and who, like her, would now find the strength to rise above them. The consequences for Officer Myers had been severe, but for Meredith, the real victory lay in knowing that her actions had led to systemic change, change that would continue to resonate in the lives of many, long after the headlines faded. After the incident at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, Meredith Cole's journey was far from over. The viral news story about her mistreatment by Officer Donovan Myers had triggered an emotional wave of support, but it would also revealed a harsh reality. Meredith knew that racial profiling in travel wasn't just about her experience. It was systemic, affecting countless others who weren't able to stand up for themselves, or worse, had no platform to demand change. The officer's treatment of her, though appalling, was just a symptom of a deeper, pervasive issue that reached beyond her singular experience. Meredith felt a powerful responsibility to leverage her position, not just as the CEO of Skyway Connect, but as someone who had the means to effect real, lasting change. The decision she made that day, to speak publicly, would forever alter the trajectory of her career and the lives of countless travelers who had endured the same humiliating treatment. Meredith had always been someone who believed in fairness and inclusivity, but it wasn't until this moment, this crushing injustice, that she realized the true depth of what was at stake. She could no longer ignore the plight of passengers who had no voice, no support. Her advocacy was no longer just about improving her airline's operations. It was about reshaping an industry that had ignored the discomfort, the shame, and the humiliation that people of color faced in airports every single day. What started as an undercover mission to investigate customer service at Skyway Connect, her own airline, quickly transformed into something much more profound. A mission to bring systemic change to the very structures that allowed racial profiling to thrive within air travel. Meredith was ready to stand not only as a CEO, but as a champion for those who had been wronged. As the public conversation around racial profiling gained momentum, Meredith realized the power of the platform she had been given. It wasn't just about her reputation or her career anymore. It was about using her influence to initiate tangible change. In the weeks that followed, Meredith began collaborating with various civil rights organizations and advocacy groups to launch new initiatives aimed at dismantling the pervasive biases within the travel industry. She implemented mandatory diversity training for her staff at Skyway Connect, recognizing that changing hearts and minds within her organization was just the first step in eradicating the biases that plagued the industry. But she didn't stop there. Meredith used her newfound voice to push for legislation that would protect passengers from discrimination, petitioning lawmakers to implement stricter oversight on the ways in which travelers were treated by airport and airline staff. The advocacy programs she championed became a catalyst for a much-needed national conversation. She introduced programs to train airline employees in cultural competency, providing them with tools to recognize and address their biases before they affected travelers. She also launched an anonymous reporting system within Skyway Connect, allowing passengers to file complaints about discrimination without fear of retaliation. These programs, while still in their infancy, began to reshape the way Skyway Connect interacted with its customers. The ripple effect was already apparent. Passengers began to feel heard, respected, and most importantly, safe. This shift in company culture was something Meredith held close to her heart. It was the kind of transformation she had always envisioned, but never fully realized until now. But for Meredith, the work didn't end with internal policies. She understood that to drive systemic change, she had to look beyond her company's walls. She began forging partnerships with nonprofit organizations, particularly those focused on racial justice and travel advocacy, to amplify her efforts. These partnerships helped Meredith address the broader systemic issues that plagued airports and airlines across the country. In one such collaboration, she worked with advocacy groups to host workshops at major airports, educating staff on recognizing implicit bias and providing them with the tools to mitigate discriminatory behaviors. Meredith wasn't just pushing for changes at Skyway Connect. She was pushing for a transformation across the entire air travel industry. Her advocacy programs were met with a mix of praise and resistance. Some of her colleagues and board members questioned the effectiveness of such initiatives, doubting whether these changes would yield tangible results. They wondered if the resources spent on implementing bias training and advocacy programs might better be used to increase profits or improve customer service. But Meredith stood firm. She knew the value of these programs wasn't just in improving Skyway Connect's bottom line. It was in improving the lives of people who had been marginalized and silenced for too long. She wasn't interested in temporary fixes or superficial changes. She wanted real, lasting reform. It was a struggle, but Meredith was unwavering in her belief that the cost of standing up for what was right was worth every challenge she faced. Behind closed doors, Meredith faced skepticism not only from colleagues but from some of her own employees. The backlash against her decision to publicly challenge Donovan Myers was intense, especially among those who believed that racial profiling wasn't a widespread issue or that the complaints she received about customer service were overstated. But Meredith's leadership and unwavering commitment to justice slowly began to win over even the most cynical. Over time, her advocacy and the changes she implemented started to bear fruit. Employees who initially resisted the training began to see the value in it. They began to understand that this wasn't just about avoiding lawsuits or improving public relations. It was about creating a culture where every single person, regardless of race, gender, or background, felt safe, valued, and respected. Meredith's efforts didn't go unnoticed. Within the airline industry, Skyway Connect's reputation as a leader in inclusivity and fairness grew, and other airlines began to take notice. Several of Meredith's counterparts reached out to learn more about her advocacy programs, eager to adopt similar practices within their own companies. For Meredith, the recognition was meaningful, but it wasn't enough. She was driven by something deeper, the belief that her work could inspire systemic change, not just within the confines of her company, but across the entire travel industry. She wasn't interested in being a singular voice in the void. She wanted to build a movement. One of the most impactful moments in Meredith's journey came when she received a message from a young Black woman who had been traveling on one of Skyway Connect's flights. The woman had read about Meredith's public stand against Officer Myers' actions and wanted to thank her for giving people like her the courage to speak up. Meredith was moved by the message. It reminded her that, while the road ahead would be long and filled with resistance, the difference she was making was already tangible. There were real people out there whose lives were being changed by the very efforts she had fought so hard to put in place. But even as Meredith's advocacy work was gaining ground, she knew the fight was far from over. She had taken the first steps toward changing the culture of the air travel industry, but the work required more than just policy changes and public statements. It required a fundamental shift in the way people thought, the way they interacted with others, and the way they saw the world. That shift, she knew, would take time. It would take persistence. But Meredith was determined to see it through. She was no longer just a CEO or an executive. She was an advocate, a leader for change. And with every new initiative, every partnership, every conversation, she was one step closer to making her vision of equality and fairness a reality. As she continued her advocacy work, Meredith's reputation as a champion for justice spread. Her story became one of resilience, a testament to the power of standing up for what's right, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. And as she watched people, from employees to passengers, begin to embrace the changes she had fought for, she knew that her journey was just beginning. Every step Meredith took was a step closer to breaking down the barriers of prejudice that had plagued the airline industry for so long, and with each victory, she was laying the foundation for a more just and inclusive future. Meredith Cole had always operated behind the scenes. As the CEO of Skyway Connect, she was a powerful force in the airline industry, but she'd never sought the spotlight. Her focus had always been on making her company a better place for customers and employees alike, ensuring that passengers felt heard, respected, and valued. But when Officer Donovan Myers, blinded by prejudice, singled her out at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, it was impossible for her to stay silent. She could have easily stayed quiet, walked away, and allowed the injustice to slip by unnoticed. But Meredith wasn't that kind of woman. She refused to let her dignity be compromised, and through her quiet strength and the calm assertion of her power, she changed everything, not just for herself, but for thousands of others who had been subjected to the same biases. Her ordeal ignited a national conversation on racial profiling and discrimination, challenging both the public and the airline industry to confront the uncomfortable truths that had lingered for far too long. As the news about her encounter spread, Meredith found herself at the center of a firestorm. The media, activists, and even everyday people rallied behind her. The story of a powerful CEO being harassed by a police officer because of her race struck a nerve with so many who had faced similar experiences. It was a stark reminder that racial bias wasn't something limited to the history books. It was alive, thriving in places people least expected it, from airports to corporate boardrooms. Meredith didn't just take the high road. She chose to stand tall, to face the uncomfortable truth of what had happened, and to challenge the system that allowed it to continue. She spoke up, not for herself, but for those who couldn't speak, for those whose voices had been silenced by the weight of prejudice. In the weeks following the incident, the public's response was overwhelming. Social media erupted with support as people from all walks of life praised Meredith's courage. But more than just the praise, it was the gratitude from everyday travelers, especially Black women, that moved Meredith the most. She received countless messages from women who told her that her strength had empowered them to speak up when they'd felt dismissed or unseen. She heard from mothers who, like her, had been made to feel like they didn't belong in spaces they had every right to occupy. They thanked her for giving them the courage to demand respect, to stand up to the subtle but powerful biases that existed in the world around them. The change Meredith had sparked wasn't just about policies or corporate initiatives. It was about people, real people, gaining the confidence to fight for themselves and to know their worth in spaces that had too often tried to erase them. Meredith's story resonated with so many, and as the airline industry started to implement the changes she fought for, it became clear that the ripple effects of her actions were far-reaching. Skyway Connect was one of the first airlines to adopt comprehensive training on racial bias, diversity, and inclusion, and that decision had a profound impact. More and more airlines followed suit, as Meredith's work set a new standard for how passengers and employees should be treated. And while the policy changes were important, the most powerful shift occurred in the hearts and minds of people. Those working in the industry, those traveling, and those witnessing the events unfold from the comfort of their homes. As Meredith walked through an airport weeks after the ordeal, a young Black woman approached her with tears in her eyes. "You don't know me," she said softly, "but what you did, it changed everything for me." The woman went on to explain that until then, she had always second-guessed herself in professional settings. She'd always felt the eyes of others judging her, questioning her place in rooms where she had every right to be. But seeing Meredith's strength, seeing her stand up not only for herself, but for every person who had been marginalized, gave her the courage to own her space. Meredith smiled, humbled and deeply moved by the woman's words. In that moment, it wasn't about being the CEO. It was about being a person who had made a real difference in someone else's life. The gratitude continued to flood in from passengers and employees alike. Skyway Connect employees, particularly those from marginalized groups, felt seen and heard in ways they hadn't before. They felt a renewed sense of pride in their company, knowing that it was a place that not only talked about fairness, but actively worked to embody it. One employee, a young man who had worked as a ground crew member for years, approached Meredith one day. "I never thought I'd work for a company that cared about us this way," he said, his voice full of emotion. "You've made us all feel like we matter." It was the kind of comment Meredith had always hoped to hear, but it was still incredibly moving to experience. She had spent years building Skyway Connect into a successful company, but the work she did after that fateful encounter, reforming policies, empowering others, and challenging systems of power, felt like her true legacy. Meredith's mission wasn't about making headlines or gaining accolades. It was about something deeper. It was about creating a world where people no longer had to wonder if they would be treated with dignity. It was about creating a culture where people didn't just tolerate diversity, they embraced it. The changes Meredith had set in motion became an essential part of her life's work. But as time went on, she came to realize something else. Every time she heard another story of someone who had been given a voice, someone who had felt empowered to stand up against injustice, she knew that the fight wasn't over. It was ongoing. But now, thanks to her efforts, there were more and more people who were standing together, fighting for equality and demanding respect in every space they occupied. The industry may have been slow to change, but Meredith had been a force of nature that propelled it forward. She had not only transformed her airline, but she had ignited a movement that continued to burn brightly long after the cameras turned off. And as she looked back on that fateful moment at the gate, she understood that it wasn't the act of injustice that defined her. It was the way she responded, the way she used her position and her platform to create a lasting impact. In the end, Meredith's story wasn't just about one woman's stand against racial bias. It was a reminder that change is possible when people find the courage to confront injustice head-on. Her legacy would live on, not just in the changes she made within the airline industry, but in the lives she touched along the way. It was a legacy of empowerment and progress, a legacy that reminded everyone that even in the face of adversity, courage can inspire transformation. So as we reflect on Meredith's journey, ask yourself, when faced with injustice, what will you do? How will you stand up for what's right? And who will you empower along the way? Change starts with a single act of courage, and together we can create a world that is fairer, kinder, and more inclusive. If Meredith's story moved you, if it made you think about the power of standing up for what's right, don't keep it to yourself. Like this video, share it with your friends and family, and leave a comment to support Meredith's legacy. Subscribe to our channel to receive more stories of empowerment and progress. Together, let's keep pushing for a world where justice and fairness are the standard, not the exception. Thank you for being a part of this journey.